All right, welcome to part 4 of our Unit 2, Biological Basis of Behavior. What we're going to be talking about today is the brain. I'm actually going to split the brain up into kind of 3 different sections, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on this next slide here. So there's kind of 3 main ways to group the sections of the brain. Now, technically we could do it a different way as well. We could go from back to front or front to back or bottom to top, but I usually tend to go from the inside outwards, and the reason I do that is because, one, it's a little bit easier to kind of remember where everything is, but it also kind of groups our different sections into kind of evolutionarily speaking, like the oldest to the newest, right? So we're going to start at the very beginning with the older structures, which are generally considered the brain stem, which is this part right here, right? You can see that kind of middle part. The second group we'll talk about is the limbic system, which is kind of this piece right here. You can kind of see these pieces that are basically kind of wrapped around a lot of the brainstem, as well as the cerebellum at the bottom here. And the last part we're going to talk about is this outer piece right here, which is the cerebrum, which is what we usually think of when we think of the brain, right? It looks like this. This is the outermost layer, right? So again, we're going from the oldest, right, evolutionarily speaking, right, into the newest. Okay, so again, this first section will be on the older structures of the brain. Sometimes this is referred to as the reptile brain, right? Because it's kind of focusing on it'd be that period evolutionarily, and it's focusing on kind of the same level of cognitive kind of abilities as we would see in something like lizards and other reptiles. Okay, so older structures of the brain. So there's kind of a few things to think about, right? So the first thing is that these are going to be pretty much almost entirely focused on the basic survival functions, right? So things that keep us alive: breathing, resting, feeding, right? Running away, right? Those kind of things that are basic functions for survival, okay? Again, a lot of times we refer to these kind of older structures of the brainstem as the quote-unquote lizard brain. And these are, again, those original components, right? These are the things that, before we were Homo sapiens, right, way before we were, even mammals necessarily, is kind of what we would have had, right? And then as we evolve, right, we add more and more and more. I'm going to move myself really quick so you can see that a little bit better. So we can categorize almost all of these older structures in the brainstem. Technically not all of it, like the thalamus isn't part of that, but all of this kind of other piece right here, this other section, would be considered the brainstem, right? The brainstem has multiple parts, and again, it's the kind of beginning focal point of the kind of first control center of creatures with that kind of thought, if that makes sense. These are the oldest and innermost region of the brain, made up of the medulla and the pons, right? So here's the medulla right there. Here's the pons right here. The spinal cord technically isn't part of the brain. That's why they're not mentioning the spinal cord here. Again, the thalamus is separate, and the midbrain is sometimes considered separate as well. But the kind of 2 big parts are the pons and the medulla. The brainstem is also where we see crossover. So we won't talk about it just yet. We'll talk about when we talk about brain hemisphere specialization, which is basically the idea that the right side of your brain controls the left side of our body, right? And the left side of our brain controls the right side of our body, right? So at this location, right, at the brainstem is where those paths cross, if that makes sense, right? So it's in each hemisphere here, and then it crosses in our brainstem, right? And then it goes to the sides of our body from there. So this is also where that's going to happen, okay? Again, these nerves that are connecting each side will cross paths. So looking at these 2 kind of first structures, right? We have the medulla and the pons. And again, I'm going to go back really quick so you can see them again, right? Medulla is right here. It's kind of like a little bump that sticks out of the top of the brainstem. Then we have the pons, which is kind of almost wrapped around it a little bit, okay? Now, one thing to notice as well is you can kind of see it a little bit in this picture. A lot of these structures, and you'll see it in the brain in general, are going to be basically kind of split in half. Right, so I mentioned there's a right side and a left side. So generally speaking, right, the brain is pretty much mirrored exactly the same on each side. It's not exactly maybe perfect, but it's going to be pretty similar. So we've got kind of this pons that kind of wraps around. There's kind of 2 sides to it, right? The medulla, I don't believe actually doesn't necessarily have 2 halves because it's so connected to the brainstem at the beginning. but you can kind of see the beginning pieces there. So again, our medulla is going to be involved in controlling our breathing and our heartbeat, right? Again, two things that are obviously vital for us to live. If our heart doesn't beat, if we don't breathe, we die, right? And so what the medulla is doing is it is just constantly, right, making those two things happen. It's telling our heart to beat all the time. It's telling us to breathe, okay? The pons is having mostly focused on coordination of movements, but it's also really important when it comes to controlling sleep, right? So mostly focused on the coordination of movements, but it's also, right, connected with this idea or how, and when we sleep, when we feel sleepy, how long we sleep, right? Obviously, like when you sleep, at some point you just wake up, right? You don't have to have something that wakes you up every day. You'll just wake up on your own. So part of that is this pons that's telling us, when to go to sleep, when to wake up. So those are kind of the two main functions there. In addition, we have the thalamus. I'm going to try and get myself out of the way here. Here we go. We have the thalamus. So the thalamus sits on top here. It's kind of like two little eggs, right, kind of sitting at the very top of the brainstem. Okay, and it actually kind of works visually really nicely here if we think about this older structures and where the thalamus is. This is the brain's kind of sensory control center. Okay, so what it's doing is it's basically receiving information from all of our different senses. So from our eyes, our ears, our skin, our tongue, our nose, right? All these different senses are going to come to the thalamus. Okay, oh, except for smell, I'm sorry. Smell is not going to go there. So all of the other senses, are going to be routed first to the thalamus, and then what the thalamus is going to do is it's basically going to shoot them to the part of the brain that they need to get to be basically like decoded, right? So again, we haven't really quite gotten into this. We get more into it, especially with sensation perception. But when information goes into our eyes, right, it gets turned into those electrical impulses. Those impulses get sent to the thalamus. The thalamus then sends it to the part of the brain that actually turns it into what we see, right? The images we see. So I always like to think of it like these control towers, right? Aircraft control towers, where there's like this long tower with the kind of skybox kind of thing on top, right, with the radar. That's kind of what our thalamus is, right? We have the tower here, and then this is our control tower on the top, right? Again, it's receiving that information, and then it's directing it where it's going to go. Our next piece is the reticular formation, right? So the reticular formation has a few different jobs. Now, the reticular formation is right here, okay? This one is tricky because it's actually like inside of the spinal cord and the brainstem, basically. It's like the middle, kind of. It's not really like a separate structure where like you see we have like the thalamus sitting right here, the cerebellum back here, right, or the pons right here. So what it is basically like a network of neurons. It's kind of just a really densely packed network of neurons that comes up right out of the spinal cord here and goes into kind of that very bottom of the brain, right, the top of the brain stem. Okay. Again, network of neurons going from the spinal cord down here, right, to the thalamus right here. Here's that thalamus. This is cut in half. That's why it doesn't look like a little egg there, but you can kind of see it right there. So it's going to the top there. Okay, that's our reticular formation. So our reticular formation has kind of two big jobs, right? One of them is multitasking, right? So this allows us to do multiple things at once, which we are obviously doing all the time. Now, we'll talk about multitasking a little bit later and kind of like the idea of multitasking as in like being able to walk and talk at the same time, which is what we're able to do because of the reticular formation, right? Not necessarily multitasking like I can watch TV and write a paper at the same time, right? And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit later and how attention works later on in our next unit. In addition, right, to this multitasking, it's involved in arousal and alertness, right? So again, you see kind of really basic survival adaptations are kind of controlled in these areas. So, when we feel nervous, when we get scared, right, when you're like walking down the hall or you're up in the middle of the night and you're walking to go to the bathroom down your hallway and it's really dark and you hear noise, right, your reticular formation is part of what's involved in, right, basically waking you up, making you feel alert, making you feel ready, for that kind of like fight or flight response. Our last piece here is the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is kind of this back piece here. It's oftentimes called the little brain. I'm going to see if I can find. So it sits right here, right? It's basically like underneath the cerebrum. So that cerebrum is kind of what we usually imagine when we see the brain, or what we picture. It sits right underneath there, okay? But it basically looks like a tiny brain on the bottom back part of the brain. It's like upside down. So what this does is actually a whole bunch of things. The cerebellum is involved in a lot, right? Two of the big ones are enabling us to learn, right, through non-verbal means, right? So the ability to like watch somebody do something and then repeat it, as well as skill memory, right? So it's really important when we're trying to observe someone and learn, right, without them speaking to us necessarily, right? The cerebellum is what's going to be really heavily involved in that. In addition, it has to do with judging time, modulating emotions, discriminating sounds and textures, as well as coordinating movement, okay? There's a whole bunch of different pieces here. Usually speaking, when people think about the cerebellum, they think about coordinating movement, right? So kind of our ability to move, like, and keep balance, if that kind of makes sense. It's not so much like literally being able to move your body, but being able to move in a way where like we're not stumbling around or falling over, is usually that cerebellum, okay? So that's kind of wraps up the majority of our older structures of the brain, right? So the main thing here is remembering what in general these are going to be focused on, right? So again, these are functions that occur, generally speaking, without conscious effort, right? So when you walk, you don't generally have to consciously think about moving your feet every step, right? You kind of just go, right? You don't consciously think about breathing usually, right? You just kind of do it. You don't consciously think about your heart beating, you just kind of do it, right? You don't consciously think like, I'm afraid, I need to get my heart rate up so that I can run away if I have to, right? Your body does it for you. So these are, generally speaking, unconscious kind of functions that are going on in our brain. They are, again, similar to the functions that we would see in reptiles, right? We don't generally see reptiles exhibiting a lot of things like emotion, or like high-level problem solving or things like that. It's focused mostly on these kind of unconscious, survival-driven functions, right, or actions. And then again, functions are generally in charge of keeping us alive, right? This is what makes sure that, you know, we don't do anything stupid or get eaten, or don't forget to eat or forget to breathe or whatever. This is what's kind of making sure we stay alive. And then lastly, again, this is our innermost layers. So we're going oldest to newest and inside to outside. All right. So please go ahead, do a quick summary for me, and then you can go ahead and move on to the next video.